It was early 1944, and the world was waiting for something to break. For nearly 5 years, the Second World War had consumed entire nations, reduced cities to rubble, and turned Europe into a map of smoke, blood, and fear. But now, after years of grinding battles in North Africa, Italy, and the skies over the continent, the Allies were finally preparing for their most daring move, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe. The fate of the free world depended on it. And yet, there was one immense obstacle standing in the way of victory: Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall. A line of fortifications, bunkers, mines, and artillery stretching from Norway to the border of Spain, the most fortified coastline in history. Behind that wall stood millions of German soldiers waiting for one thing: the Allied invasion they knew would come. But where? That single question would become the hinge of history, and the Allies would answer it not with armies, but with imagination. They would build a lie so elaborate, so convincing, that it fooled the most feared intelligence machine in the world. This is the unbelievable story of Operation Fortitude, the grand deception that helped win World War II. It all began with a simple problem. How do you land hundreds of thousands of troops on a hostile shore without being slaughtered the moment you arrive? Every commander knew that if the Germans guessed the location of the invasion correctly, the whole operation would fail before it began. Hitler had over 50 divisions stationed along the French coast from the sandy beaches of Normandy to the narrowest stretch of water between Britain and France, the Pas de Calais, and that right there was the key. The Pas de Calais was the shortest crossing from England to France, only about 20 miles across the English Channel. Logically, it was the most obvious place to invade. The Germans were sure of it. Their entire defensive strategy revolved around that assumption. So when the Allies met in late 1943 to plan the invasion, they decided to use that logic against them. They would attack in Normandy but make Hitler believe Calais was the real target. This wasn't going to be a small diversion. It had to be massive, convincing, unshakable. The Germans had to believe that the Normandy landings were merely a feint, a distraction before the real blow fell at Calais. The Allies weren't just going to fight a war of bullets and bombs, they were about to fight a war of imagination. That's how Operation Fortitude was born. It was part of a larger deception plan called Operation Bodyguard, a network of interlocking lies designed to keep the Germans guessing. Winston Churchill had named it himself, inspired by his belief that in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Fortitude was that bodyguard. It would protect the truth of D-Day by creating an even bigger lie. The operation had 2 parts. Fortitude North, aimed at convincing the Germans that the Allies would invade Norway, and Fortitude South, the masterpiece, which would make them believe the real invasion would hit Calais. If both worked, Hitler would keep tens of thousands of troops far from Normandy, too far to stop the real attack when it came. The genius of Fortitude was that it wasn't about inventing something random. It was about confirming what the enemy already believed. And the Germans believed 2 things very strongly. First, that Calais was the most logical invasion site, and second, that General George S. Patton, the fiery, aggressive, tank-loving American general, would lead the attack. So the Allies decided to give Hitler exactly what he expected. They would invent a massive army, the first US Army Group Fusag supposedly commanded by General Patton himself. This fake army would assemble in southeastern England, directly across the Channel from Calais. To the Germans, it would look like the invasion of Calais was not only possible, it was inevitable. But how do you create an army that doesn't exist? You start with paper false orders, fake reports, unit insignias, and phony paperwork. Then you move to the air-fake radio chatter between units, carefully scripted and broadcast at specific times so that German interceptors would pick it up. The Allies even used special radio operators trained to mimic the styles and rhythms of specific army divisions, so it sounded like real traffic. Next came the visuals: inflatable tanks, dummy trucks, fake landing craft made of wood and canvas, and entire fake airfields filled with wooden planes. From above, to the eye of a German reconnaissance pilot, it all looked authentic, a massive build-up of men and machines, preparing for the assault on Calais. And to sell the illusion even further, Patton himself was photographed inspecting his troops in the southeast of England, giving speeches, visiting local towns, and appearing exactly where German spies expected him to be. Every movement, every rumour, every piece of gossip about the Patton army was carefully engineered. But the real secret weapon of Operation Fortitude wasn't inflatable tanks, it was people. Specifically, double agents. By 1944, Britain's intelligence service, MI5, had managed to capture or turn nearly every German spy operating in the country. They ran them through a special unit known as the 20 Committee XX, in Roman numerals, symbolising the double cross. These agents, now working for the Allies, became the backbone of the deception plan. They would feed the Germans believable, carefully curated information, confirming what Fortitude wanted them to believe. The most legendary of them all was a Spanish man named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British. Garbo had initially offered his services to the Germans before the war, pretending to be a loyal spy, but he secretly despised fascism. The British discovered him and turned him into one of the most effective double agents in history. Garbo didn't just pass along fake reports, he built an entire imaginary network of sub-agents, dozens of fictional characters scattered across the UK, each with their own backstories, specialties and styles of reporting. Through this imaginary web, Garbo was able to flood the German intelligence network with an overwhelming stream of information, almost all of it false, and the Germans ate it up. They trusted him completely, believing his network to be one of their most valuable sources in Britain. So when Garbo began reporting that a huge invasion force was massing in Kent under General Patton's command, and that all intelligence pointed to Calais as the target, Berlin believed it without question. Operation Fortitude was working. Meanwhile, the other half of the deception, Fortitude North, was feeding the Germans fake reports about an Allied build-up in Scotland, supposedly preparing to invade Norway. The goal was to keep the Germans' northern divisions tied up there, unable to move south. Between Fortitude North and South, the Germans were now convinced that they faced not one, but two major invasions, one in Norway and one in Calais. Normandy barely registered as a serious threat, and that was exactly how the Allies wanted it. Still, maintaining such a vast illusion required constant care. Every fake unit needed fake supply shipments. Every radio message needed a logical reason. Even the weather had to match the story. The British went so far as to hire actors to play officers in pubs near where the fake divisions were stationed. Making sure the right rumours reached the right ears, nothing was left to chance. And while this army of illusion was taking shape, the real invasion force, the one that would actually land in Normandy, was quietly gathering in the southwest of England, hidden by strict secrecy and misdirection. As D-Day approached, Fortitude's importance grew beyond imagination. The success of the entire Allied invasion now rested on whether Hitler believed the lie. And as the spring of 1944 unfolded, the lie began to take on a life of its own. Across the Channel, German reconnaissance pilots continued to photograph southeastern England and report back to Berlin with proof of massive preparations for an invasion of Calais. They saw rows of landing craft, columns of tanks, endless supply depots, and every image was exactly what the Allies wanted them to see. In reality, most of what the cameras captured were elaborate props, inflatable Shermans, canvas Spitfires, and dummy landing barges made from painted wood. The sheer audacity of it all was staggering, but so was the meticulous planning behind every detail. Nothing in Fortitude was left to chance. When a reconnaissance aircraft might be expected to fly overhead, soldiers would rush out to move the dummies, leaving track marks in the dirt so it looked like real manoeuvring had taken place. They even used heating devices under the fake aircraft so infrared photos would show the same engine warmth that real planes would have given off. German analysts pored over these photos, convinced they were seeing an enormous concentration of Allied power aimed directly at the Pas de Calais. Meanwhile, Patton, the ultimate decoy, played his role with relish. After his public fall from grace in Sicily for slapping a soldier, he had been sidelined from frontline command, but now he found himself cast as the star of the greatest stage play in military history. Wherever he went, German spies took note. His every movement became evidence. Patton toured southeastern England, inspecting airfields, addressing troops, and making sure he was seen in just the right places. He was quite literally leading an army of ghosts, and he played the part so well that the Germans would continue to fear him long after the real invasion began. Behind the scenes, the masterminds of Fortitude men like Colonel John Bevan of the London Controlling Section and the brilliant minds of the 20 Committee coordinated hundreds of tiny deceptions that all pointed to the same false conclusion. Double agents sent carefully timed reports, fake radio chatter hummed day and night, coded weather bulletins hinted at launch windows, even shipping records were manipulated to make Calais seem like the only possible target. And yet, all of it depended on one fragile thing: human belief. The Allies weren't just faking evidence, they were manipulating psychology. They knew the German High Command was convinced that the shortest route to Pas-de-Calais was the logical invasion point. They also knew that Hitler, increasingly paranoid and distrustful of his own generals, tended to cling to his first impressions. So Fortitude was just designed to change his mind, it was designed to confirm it. Every false clue fed directly into what Hitler already wanted to believe. In that way, the Allies didn't fight his intelligence system, they hijacked it. Throughout May 1944, as the Allies finalised their plans for the real D-Day landings in Normandy, Fortitude kept the Germans fixated on the wrong spot. The double agents became the unseen warriors of this invisible front. Garbo in particular orchestrated a masterpiece of misinformation. Using his fictional network, he sent dozens of messages to his supposed German handlers, describing the massive build-up in Kent and the constant flow of reinforcements heading to the southeast coast. He even provided supposed schedules for troop embarkations and detailed descriptions of the 1st US Army Group S organization. His reports were so convincing that the Germans transmitted them directly to Hitler's personal headquarters without alteration. Garbos' influence grew so immense that he later received the Iron Cross Germany's military honour, personally approved by Hitler himself, even as he worked for the Allies. At the same time, Fortitude North continued its quiet success. False radio signals between non-existent divisions in Scotland, combined with agent reports, convinced the German command that an invasion of Norway was imminent. As a result, they kept roughly 250,000 soldiers tied down in Scandinavia troops, who might otherwise have been sent to reinforce France. Piece by piece, the deception was locking the German army into paralysis. Then came June. The Allies were ready, the fleets were assembled, the paratroopers trained, the landing craft fueled. On June 5, 1944, as Eisenhower gave the final go-ahead for Operation Overlord, storm clouds gathered over the Channel. The invasion was postponed for 24 hours, and during that tense delay, Fortitude's illusions continued their hypnotic work. In Berlin, Hitler's intelligence officers reported no sign of movement from the Patton army. Everything still pointed to Calais. Early the next morning, June 6, 1944, the real invasion began. Under cover of darkness, thousands of ships crossed the rough seas toward Normandy. At dawn, Allied paratroopers were already behind enemy lines, and waves of infantry were hitting the beaches at Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The largest amphibious invasion in history had begun, and yet at Hitler's headquarters in the Wolfes Lair, the reaction was confusion. Reports of landings in Normandy arrived quickly, but most German commanders assumed they were merely diversionary raids, just as Fortitude had predicted they would. The real attack, they insisted, would still come at Calais. Hitler himself was asleep when the first reports came in. His staff didn't dare wake him. When he finally emerged hours later and heard that Allied forces were ashore in Normandy, he dismissed it as a feint. He ordered his panzer divisions to stay put near Calais. Those precious armoured divisions, among the most powerful in the Wehrmacht, remained frozen in place for crucial days, while Allied troops fought desperately to expand their beachhead. On the beaches, every hour mattered. At Omaha, American forces faced devastating fire. At Sword and Juneau, British and Canadian units struggled to link up, but slowly, painfully, they gained ground. And as the battle raged, the Germans still believed Fortitude's story. Garbo-S reports continued to reinforce the illusion, describing further preparations for a second, larger invasion by Patton-S forces aimed squarely at Calais. Other agents added their own details, reports of fresh divisions arriving in southeastern England, of new convoys assembling, of Patton holding his attack until the main diversion at Normandy had drawn German strength away. It was brilliant psychological warfare. Even as Allied tanks rolled inland, German intelligence clung to the belief that Normandy was merely the opening act. For nearly 7 weeks after D-Day, Hitler refused to transfer his Calais reserves to Normandy. When his generals begged to redeploy them, he barked back that they must wait for the real invasion. This hesitation crippled Germany's ability to counterattack effectively. By the time Hitler finally realized the truth, it was far too late. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were racing toward the Rhine. Fortitude had done its job so completely that even the collapse of the Calais front didn't shatter the illusion immediately. German commanders still feared Patton's Phantom Army might appear somewhere else along the coast. In July 1944, as the Allies surged forward, German intelligence analysts reviewed their own reports in disbelief. The photographic evidence, the agent communications, the radio intercepts, all of it had seemed irrefutable. They couldn't comprehend how they'd been deceived so completely. But that was the beauty of Fortitude. Every piece of false information had been built on a foundation of truth. Real soldiers guarded real areas, real convoys moved through real ports, but their purpose was twisted. The illusion worked because it didn't look like a lie. It looked like the truth seen through a narrow lens, and for the Allies, that narrow lens gave them the breathing room to secure Normandy and turn the tide of the war in Western Europe. The brilliance of Fortitude didn't end with D-Day's success. It continued to ripple across the battlefields of Europe, weaving confusion and hesitation through the German chain of command for weeks afterward. As Allied divisions pushed slowly through the hedgerows of Normandy in June and July 1944, the ghosts of the 1st US Army Group still haunted Hitler's imagination. Reports from Garbo and other double agents kept arriving in Berlin, each reinforcing the same idea. The Normandy landings were only a diversion, and the main blow at Calais was imminent. The Germans intercepted fake radio chatter about embarkation schedules for Patton's non-existent divisions, saw new dummy landing craft appear along the coast of Kent, and even received photographic evidence from their own reconnaissance planes, pictures deliberately staged to show activity that wasn't real. Entire staffs within the German intelligence network devoted themselves to tracking Patton's Phantom Army, charting its movements, and predicting when it would finally cross the Channel. Hitler's obsession with Calais became almost pathological. He repeatedly ordered that no troops be moved from the region, even when his generals pleaded for reinforcements in Normandy. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of the Western Front, and Field Marshal Rommel, the famed Desert Fox now charged with defending France, both recognized by late June that Normandy was the true invasion. They begged Hitler to release the 15th Army stationed near Calais, but Hitler refused, convinced by Fortitude's illusions that Patton was merely waiting for the right weather window. The enemy must be trying to draw us away from the main point, he insisted. And so, the German armour that might have smashed the Allies on the beaches sat idle, while Eisenhower's forces built strength, linked their beachheads, and poured men and material into France. Fortitude's success was so absolute that even German aerial reconnaissance, which could have exposed the deception, was rendered almost useless by Allied air superiority. The Luftwaffe had been beaten from the skies. Few planes dared to venture over Britain, and those that did were often guided by the very deceptions the Allies wanted them to see. The dummy camps of southeastern England remained intact long after D-Day, convincing analysts that a second invasion was only days away. Meanwhile, in the real war zone, Patton was given command of the newly formed Third Army in July 1944, and when he finally rolled into action in Normandy, German intelligence analysts thought it was impossible. Their own reports said he was still in England preparing for Calais. That contradiction alone caused chaos in the German High Command. Some believed Patton's presence in Normandy proved the Allies had cancelled the Calais assault at the last minute. Others thought the Allies had somehow cloned their most feared general, assigning him to two armies at once. By the time they realised that Patton's Fusag had never existed, France was collapsing. In August 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, breaking out of Normandy and sweeping across the French countryside in a tidal wave of armour and artillery. Paris was liberated by the end of the month, and the German army in the west was in full retreat. Fortitude hadn't just protected D-Day, it had crippled the enemy's ability to respond strategically for months. But what made Fortitude truly legendary wasn't just its tactical success. It was the scope of imagination behind it. Thousands of individuals had contributed to the deception, many of them unaware of the full picture. Artists and engineers designed inflatable tanks and dummy aircraft that could be assembled in hours and looked real even up close. Radio specialists built intricate communication schedules to simulate entire corps and divisions. Intelligence officers crafted backstories for imaginary units, complete with insignias, unit histories, and even fake letters home. The logistics were staggering. Fuel depots that contained no fuel, ammunition dumps filled with empty crates, and entire networks of roads and bridges designed for vehicles that would never roll. Civilians who lived near the fake installations saw soldiers coming and going, actors, clerks, and occasionally real troops playing temporary roles, never realizing they were part of a deception that might decide the fate of Europe. And while the physical props dazzled enemy eyes, it was the human element, the double agents, that made the illusion breathe. Alongside Garbo operated other key figures. Brutus, a Polish officer named Roman Czerniawski, who had once spied for the Germans before switching sides. Tricycle, a Yugoslav playboy named Dusko Popov, who mingled with high society and passed gossip that conveniently matched Fortitude as narrative. And Tate, a Norwegian named Wolf Schultz, who sent detailed but entirely fabricated reports about military preparations. Each of these agents fed information carefully crafted by the 20 Committee, and together they created a tapestry of lies so consistent, so plausible, that not even the Abwehr's most skeptical analysts could unravel it. After the war, many intelligence officers admitted they had never considered that all their British sources might be compromised. They had built an entire worldview on data that was poisoned from the start. Even after the Allies had crossed the Seine and were marching toward Belgium, German commanders still hesitated to move the 15th Army from Calais, fearing it would leave them exposed to Patton's phantom blow. By September, those divisions were still waiting, trapped in defensive positions, while the real Patton thundered through France and into Lorraine. Operation Fortitude had done far more than buy time. It had reshaped the strategic geography of the Western Front. The psychological impact on Hitler himself was profound. The dictator, increasingly isolated and distrustful, began to suspect that his own intelligence officers were withholding information. He accused them of incompetence and conspiracy, issuing contradictory orders that left his field commanders paralyzed. When Rommel was gravely injured by an Allied air attack in mid-July, the coherence of German command in the West disintegrated entirely. Fortitude had exploited not just geography and logistics, but Hitler's own personality as arrogance, his obsession with Calais, his belief that the enemy thought as he did. The deception succeeded because it mirrored his mind. In retrospect, historians have marvelled at how close the Allies came to catastrophe and how much depended on Fortitude's credibility. If Hitler had released his armoured divisions on June 6th or 7, the beaches might have run red and the invasion might have been thrown back into the sea. But because of a web of lies spun months earlier, he hesitated. That hesitation was the difference between victory and disaster, and as the Allies advanced, they continued to use deception as a strategic weapon. Smaller operations, inspired by Fortitude, misled the Germans about crossings of the Rhine, attacks in Italy, and even the timing of the final push into Germany. The lessons of 1944 became doctrine: control the enemy's mind and you control the battlefield. As the guns of Europe thundered on and the tide of war turned decisively against Nazi Germany, the shadows cast by Operation Fortitude lingered far longer than the smoke on the beaches of Normandy. Even months after D-Day, German intelligence files continued to reference the mythical 1st US Army Group, analysing its supposed composition and debating when it would finally strike. Entire memoranda were written about Patton's missing divisions, as though bureaucratic paperwork could summon ghosts into existence. The irony was that by then the real Patton had become exactly what the Germans had always feared: a rampaging, unpredictable commander tearing through France, his armoured columns swallowing territory at an astonishing pace. When German officers finally learned that the Calais army had never existed, they couldn't believe it. The evidence had been too detailed, too overwhelming. Many thought the Allies must have erased the proof to cover their tracks, yet the truth was simpler and far more extraordinary. The most successful army in history had never fired a single shot, because it had never been real. After the liberation of Paris and the Allied drive toward the Rhine, Fortitude's architects quietly disbanded their phantom forces. The inflatable tanks were deflated, the wooden aircraft dismantled, the radio operators reassigned. The props that had once held Hitler's gaze were packed into warehouses where they would sit forgotten for years. Only a handful of people truly understood how much those illusions had mattered. Inside the British intelligence community, the 20 Committee toasted its success in secret, proud that every single German spy in Britain had been turned and that every one of them had played a role in deceiving the enemy. Juan Pujol Garcia, Agent Garbo received a medal from both sides, an Iron Cross from Hitler and an MBE from King George VI, though neither award could capture the magnitude of his achievement. When the war ended, Garbo disappeared, faking his own death in Angola before resurfacing decades later in Venezuela, a quiet man who had once helped save civilization with nothing more than words and imagination. The other double agents faded into peacetime anonymity, their stories classified, their names unknown to the very soldiers whose lives they had safeguarded. It would take decades for historians to uncover the full scale of Operation Fortitude. When the documents were finally declassified in the 1970s, the world was astonished. The sheer audacity of the plan, the fake armies, the forged paperwork, the theatrical pageantry of deception seemed more like a Hollywood script than a military campaign. But beneath the spectacle lay a profound truth about warfare, that victory depends as much on perception as on firepower. Fortitude had rewritten the rules. By manipulating Hitler's mind, the Allies had shown that information could be a weapon more powerful than any bomb. The ripple effects of that realization shaped the Cold War era. Psychological operations, misinformation campaigns, and elaborate ruses became staples of modern strategy, all owing their lineage to that summer of 1944 when truth itself went undercover. For the people who had lived through it, though, the memories were deeply personal. British villagers who had once watched soldiers inflate rubber tanks in their fields would later tell their grandchildren about the pretend army that fooled Hitler. Veterans who had landed on the beaches of Normandy would learn years later that invisible allies, the spies and forgers and wireless operators, had cleared the way before them with lies instead of bullets. Historians would debate endlessly how much Fortitude shortened the war, but all agreed that without it, the cost of liberating Europe would have been far greater. Every hour of hesitation Fortitude bought on June 6th was paid for in lives saved. The genius of the operation lay not only in its imagination but in its restraint. It never claimed more than it needed to, never shouted its lies too loudly. It let the enemy connect the dots themselves, guiding them gently toward the conclusions they were already predisposed to draw. That subtlety was what made it art. In the years after the war, as Europe rebuilt and the horrors of Nazism receded into history, the story of Fortitude remained mostly hidden behind official secrecy. When it finally emerged, it felt like discovering a hidden chapter of human creativity, one where artists, engineers, and storytellers had joined generals and soldiers on the same battlefield. There were tales of stage designers from London's West End crafting camouflage nets, of painters using perspective tricks to make plywood tanks look three-dimensional, of mathematicians calculating how radio transmissions should echo across the ether to simulate entire corps on the move. It was warfare as theatre, deception as salvation. Perhaps the most striking testament to Fortitude's success came from the enemy itself. In the post-war interrogations, captured German officers expressed bewilderment at how thoroughly they had been duped. General Jodl, one of Hitler's top staff officers, admitted that even in late July 1944 he had believed the Normandy landings to be secondary. The Abwehrzone analysts confessed that their faith in agents like Garbo had been absolute. "We were blinded by too much detail," one said, a fitting epitaph for an intelligence system strangled by its own certainty. And in that irony lies Fortitude's final lesson. That information, when misdirected, becomes its own trap. By feeding the Germans truths that were almost correct, the Allies made it impossible for them to see the real truth when it mattered most. As decades passed and the veterans of that era grew old, Fortitude transformed from a military secret into a symbol of human ingenuity. Documentaries, books, and films retold the story of the phantom army that never existed, each version marveling at how imagination had defeated tyranny. But to those who understand the delicate mechanics behind it, the operation remains more than a historical curiosity. It is a blueprint for how minds can be guided, how belief can be shaped, and how storytelling, the oldest art of all, can decide the outcome of the most terrible conflicts. Today, when we look back on the black and white footage of D-Day, of soldiers wading through surf and smoke toward destiny, it is easy to forget that behind those images stood another kind of army, an invisible legion of deceivers, planners, and dreamers who fought with ideas instead of rifles. Their battlefield was the imagination of their enemy, and on that front they achieved a victory as decisive as any on the sands of Normandy. Operation Fortitude remains one of history's greatest deceptions, a masterpiece of coordination and cunning that proved the pen, the paintbrush, and the radio transmitter could be mightier than the sword. Its legacy endures not only in military textbooks, but in every lesson about critical thinking, every reminder that seeing is not always believing. In the end, the Phantom Army did exactly what it was created to do. It protected the truth long enough for freedom to land on the beaches of France. And perhaps that is the greatest twist of all, that in a war defined by destruction, it was a lie that helped bring the world back to truth.